Hey Northview, this weekend we are in week 2 of a series called I Love My Church. Last weekend I shared with you our God-given vision, or in other words, where God is taking us as a church. This week I want us to talk about groups. Groups are a great place to make new friends, and honestly, I would love it if I could get every one of you into a small group. But instead of me talking about it, I thought it might actually be better for you to hear from Derek Irvin, the pastor on our staff, who's been in charge of groups for the last 13 years. Derek and his wife, Missy, began attending Northview 16 years ago. He then left the business world 13 years ago to become a part of our staff. Today, Derek serves as pastor of both groups and teams for all of our campuses. Derek's been married to Missy for 24 years, and they have 2 sons and a daughter, as well as a 7-year-old grandson. Listen, guys, I've worked with Derek for a long time, and I can tell you he is the real deal. He loves God, and he loves this church.
Both Tracy and I, we grew up Catholic, and to be involved in a small group is never anything that we ever experienced at any point in time. To be a part of a small group to where that environment is totally the opposite, to where people share freely and are transparent and are there with you in your journey and developing a relationship with Jesus has been truly transformational for both Tracy and I.
My life group meets twice a month, and in between those formal meetings, we are texting each other, checking in with each other, going out to dinner with each other, and it's just basically doing life together, which is absolutely amazing.
So the reason I joined a life group was because I grew up seeing my parents in their own life group, and I've had friends from that life group for 17 years. And so graduating from college, I want to jump into a life group and have that same experience for myself.
The first time I went to go to a life group, I'm thinking like, gosh, I don't know these people. I'm going to somebody else's house. Am I going to feel welcome? Am I going to feel odd? What's my escape plan if this doesn't really work? And I'll be honest with you, the first time I showed up, the open arms and the welcoming made you feel great.
We're family. We do life together. We love each other. We pray for each other. We had instant connection. It was amazing.
Life groups really helped me grow in my faith. They helped me grow as a husband, as a father. They helped me to become a better friend to those around me. I think they helped me become more like Jesus in my relationships.
What I love most about my life group is that the women that are in my group, I know are there for me. Life happens, and it can be difficult sometimes, and to know that I have them on my side is just absolutely the best.
I love that it is more than just a small group of people that we know in the church, but it really becomes a family.
One thing I love about my life group is that it makes a big church feel small.
I love my group because we're really cohesive together. We have a lot of things in common. We share the same commonalities together, and we have a lot of fun.
If you're considering whether or not to plug into a small group, to make that reach out, you have to take the chance. You have to take the risk. You can't sit at church and wait for it to come to you. And give God a chance to introduce you to people that'll just love you and accept you and become a part of your life and your family. It is absolutely worth the risk. I don't think anybody will ever be disappointed.
I love my life group.
I love my life group.
I love my life group.
Isn't that cool? Well, it is so good to be here with you today for week 2 of I Love My Church. My name is Derek, and I serve in a role providing leadership for our groups and teams across all of our campuses. And man, there are so many things that I love about my church. One of the things that I love most is getting to hear the stories of how God is working in the lives of people here at Northview. It's just an incredible reminder that every single one of us has a story, and every story matters to God. Personally, I find that I like stories that make me feel. I find I can connect with those. I think that we all know real when we hear it. And there's just something about when people are willing to be real, it draws us in. And this is the same thing that I love about groups. which of course is another thing that I love about my church. Groups are this environment where you get to hear people's backstories. You know, one of the things that I've learned over the years is that when I know where somebody has been in their life, it really helps me to appreciate them. It's kind of like when I get their backstory, I get them in a whole new way. And, you know, I think this is a principle that's just true in life. It's true in relationships, it's true in groups, it's true in the workplace. And the principle is this: when I get the backstory, I get the beauty. I get the beauty of who they are and the story that God is writing in their life. And so I thought I would share with you just a little bit of my backstory. My wife and I came to Northview 16 years ago. But what's interesting about our story is that we actually started to love our church before we ever even attended our church. It was about a year before we came to Northview. Our oldest son was 15 years old, and he was going through a really dark and difficult time. And as parents, I mean, honestly, we didn't know what to do. We sought out a Christian counselor to get some advice to try and figure out how to parent through this season. And so this counselor just so happened went to Northview. And as he began to meet with our son over the weeks, he encouraged our son to go on a retreat that his church was putting on called the Youth Discipleship Walk. Now, I had no idea what a youth discipleship walk was, but I'll tell you, I thought there was no way that my son would go on this. He was very much an introvert. He did not like crowds and social situations, especially where he didn't know people. And even beyond that, he was at a place in life where he was really distancing himself from people, isolating, even in the way he dressed. It was almost like it was designed to keep people at arm's length. He was wearing all black at the time, kind of goth style. He went through a phase where he was painting his fingernails black. Not our favorite, you know, but as parents, I mean, honestly, we were just trying to pick our battles and navigate through a difficult season. So our son goes on this youth discipleship walk. Ends up having an incredible weekend, largely because there was an adult table leader who did a phenomenal job in showing love to our son. This 43-year-old adult leader had our 15-year-old son paint his fingernails black, just as a statement to show the other guys at the table that it doesn't matter what's on the outside, that God looks at the heart. And that simple gesture really built a bridge to his heart. He wrote a poem over that weekend, just expressing what it was like to have experienced God's love. And months later, like 6 months later, I ran into that same leader who'd done such an incredible job of loving on my son. And he told me, he said, you know what? I still carry that poem your son wrote with me in my Bible wherever I go. I'll tell you, that really touched me. I remember telling my wife, I said, man, I am really liking this church. And she turned to me and she said, I like any church that'll love on my kid like that. And that is the heart of Northview. And that was when I first started to love my church. And so a year later, when my family and I just came to a place where we decided it was time to find another church, of course, we came to Northview. And the very first weekend we came, ironically, was the weekend they were signing up a bunch of people to be in life groups, you know. So we jumped right in, and a week later, we're in a home sharing our story, connecting and bonding. And it has led to so many spiritually significant moments in our life, more than I could possibly share in this moment here. But as I look back over the years, I'm blown away at how God has used the ministry of Northview Church to write his story in my heart and in the heart of my family. And you know, that is what God does. He's like this novelist. He's the author of our stories. Hebrews 12:2 says, Jesus is the author and perfecter of our faith. He is actively at work in our lives, writing our stories. Another verse that I've always loved, Jeremiah 29:11, says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you a hope and a future." And not only is God like a novelist who's writing our stories, but if I could use another analogy, he's also like an artist who loves to create. You know, all throughout creation, we see his handiwork. I remember when my kids were little, we would see a beautiful sunset, and I would try to help them make that connection. And I would say, okay, kids, you know how you like to color pictures. Well, look up at the sky. That's like the picture that God colored. And as they looked up, we would go, "Yay, God!" And they would join us in that. And they would giggle in their excitement, and their eyes would get big with wonder at what God had made. Well, the psalmist does something similar when he looks to the sky. And here's what he says. He says, "When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have set in place, what is mankind that you are mindful of them? Human beings that you care for them." Notice that when the psalmist compares himself to the vastness of all that God has created, he feels incredibly small. I know I've felt that. I'm guessing that you felt that as well. Whether if it's standing in front of the Grand Canyon or the ocean or the mountains, there's something about that that comparatively makes us feel inconsequential. But yet, as counterintuitive as it seems, when it comes to the work of art in which God is most proud, it is you and I. Ephesians 2:10 says it this way, "For we are God's masterpiece." Take that in for a moment. God is a prolific artist, but yet he calls us his masterpiece. He has created us anew in Christ Jesus so we can do the good works he planned for us long ago. Now, I have the opportunity to work with a number of people here at the church who are legit artists. Now, me, not so much. And I'll tell you what's worse. Not only am I not an artist, but I don't always get art. Now, don't get me wrong, there's some art that I get. I mean, I see it, I'm like, wow, that's beautiful. Or I hear it, and I immediately feel. But then again, there's some art that I don't get at all. And I'll tell you what's worse. What's worse is when you're with somebody who seems to be getting it. Oh my goodness, how annoying is that? I mean, they're looking at this saying, oh, it's full of meaning. And I'm thinking to myself, are you kidding me right now? It looks like a third grader did that. Whatever it is that they are getting is totally lost on me. But here's what I found. Sometimes when I get the backstory, I get the beauty. You see, sometimes when I understand what the artist had in mind, I get it. Or when I understand maybe what the artist had experienced in their life that caused them to express themselves in the way that they did, I appreciate it in a whole new way. So let me give you an illustration that may kind of drive this point home by sharing with you just a little bit of the backstory of Beethoven. And so what I want to do is play a short clip that is a song that Beethoven wrote called Moonlight Sonata. So listen to this. Beautiful song. And if you want to hear the whole song, go to any sixth grade piano recital and you can hear the whole thing. So in addition to this song and his many other works, he composed a total of 9 symphonies in his lifetime. The 9th symphony he composed while he was totally deaf. So he never even actually heard that symphony that he created. But maybe you know that part of Beethoven's backstory. But here is a part of his backstory that maybe you don't know. Okay, you ready? Here it is. You see, love totally eluded Beethoven his entire life. Now, why do you think that is? Was it because his parents named him Ludwig? Maybe. No, love eluded Beethoven his entire life because he was born a commoner and he had the misfortune of falling in love with a woman of nobility in a time and a place where social class mattered. And this actually happened to him more than once in his life. Can you imagine that? All of that talent, known and admired by all, playing before kings, but yet the one thing that you want most in life, to be able to marry the woman you love, is just outside of your reach, simply because you're born of the wrong social class. Well, Beethoven wrote a song and he dedicated it to this woman. And the song is Moonlight Sonata. And I want to play for you another clip, but this time as you listen to it, I want you to listen through the lens of what it would be like to, on one hand, have it all, but on the other hand, for love to just be outside of your reach. So listen to this. Even though I know that song, knowing the backstory, I hear it in just a little different way. I hear in that somber melody an expression of longing, of unrequited love, of desperation and release. When I get the backstory, I get the beauty. And this principle, that when I get the backstory, I appreciate things in a new way, well, it's true of God's artwork as well. Remember, you and I are God's art. We are his masterpiece. But here's the thing. Sometimes I don't get God's art either. Now, don't get me wrong. Some of God's art is easy to love. Like when people do exactly what I ask. Easy to love. When people make me feel great about myself. Easy to love. I like that art. But candidly, some of God's art, not so easy to love. Some of his art just leaves me scratching my head. But this same principle that I found to be true in the art world is true of God's masterpieces as well. When I get the backstory, I get the beauty. When I understand where somebody has been in their life, it helps me to connect to them and see them in a new way. I come to appreciate what God is doing in their life. And maybe even why they do the things they do. When I get the backstory, I get the beauty. And this is why I love groups. You see, groups are like art appreciation. It is not only an environment where it's safe for me to be able to share what's going on in my life, but they are able to do the same. And as we share our stories, we come to see and value each other in a whole new way. So let me share with you what groups look like here at Northview. We have 3 different types of groups. We have life groups, we have growth groups, and we have life recovery groups. Of the 3, the largest by far are life groups, with over 400 life groups meeting in homes all across central Indiana. So what is a life group? Well, a life group is a group made up of about 8 to 14 people who meet every week or every other week, typically in a home, to do a study, to pray, to encourage one another, and to connect relationally. So that's what a life group is. But I gotta tell you, that's not what makes a life group special. You see, what makes a life group special is harder to articulate, because what makes a life group special is that a good life group is like family. It's a place to belong. It's like, these are my people. It's a group you can do life with. A good life group is energy giving. You know how sometimes small talk can suck the life out of you and drain your energy, whereas talking with some close friends can be life-giving and give you energy. That is what a good life group is like. And our life groups are not just for adults. Starting in 7th grade, our students start to meet in a life group in homes. My two kids that grew up here at Northview had the same adult leader from 7th grade all the way through 12th grade. I can't even begin to tell you how valuable it is to have adults investing in our kids in that way. So regardless of your age or your stage of life, we have a life group for you. So I mentioned that there are two additional types of groups, growth group and life recovery group. And so let me just briefly describe what those are. So a growth group is like a life group, but it leans into the study side of group life. And so not all of us grew up going to church every week and knowing all of the Bible stories. And so it can be really helpful sometimes to fill in some of those missing knowledge gaps. And so examples of growth groups would be our SOAP Bible study, our Authentic Manhood group, Alpha, Adorned, our men's and women's Bible studies, to name a few. And you can get a full list on our website or at the Groups and Teams directory, which you can get at the Info Center. And then the other category is our life recovery group. Now, a life recovery group is like a life group, but it leans into what I'll just call the life happens side of group life. And so an example of one of these groups is the Take Your Life Back group led by Steve and Misty Otterburn. They're going to be starting that group up here at the Carmel campus on October 20th. And it's just a great group to get insight and support in dealing with life's challenges. There's another group that should be on your radar, which is outstanding, called Growth Seekers. It is a group that takes a deep dive into self-awareness, emotional health, spiritual growth, and it will make you a better leader and have better relationships. And then we have a number of issue-specific groups, such as groups offering support for things like sexual integrity for both men and women, betrayal, divorce, grief, cancer, abuse, and addiction. And again, you can get a full listing on our website or in the Groups and Teams directory. Now, sometimes people will notice that as I rattle off some of those group names, that not every group is offered at every campus. And I just want to touch on that briefly. Being a multi-site church, basically you have two strategies that you can choose. One strategy is you can say, we're not going to do a group anywhere unless we can do a group everywhere. And I understand why some churches do that. The other strategy is you can kind of flip that upside down and you can say, no, we're going to make it possible for any group to start at any campus. And we've chosen that route because we believe it creates the possibility of innovation. So for example, our Every Man's Battle group and our Women in the Battle group started as a life group of 10 to 12 people meeting in a home. And today it is meeting at 5 different Northview campuses with over 150 people meeting each week, getting support. And in addition to that, there are 6 other churches in multiple states that are tracking with what we're doing because they need that same thing. Now, if we would have had that group at every campus on day one, it would have never gotten off the ground. So I think you can see why we chose that strategic direction. So, you can get into one of these groups any time of year, but especially if you're not currently in a life group, this is the perfect season to get into a group because we are getting ready to start the Spiritual Growth Campaign. Now, the Spiritual Growth Campaign is a 6-week series, and we do this every year where we integrate what we're doing in our life groups in with what's happening in the weekend service. And so what that means functionally is that if you are not in a life group for this 6-week series, you are not going to get the full experience. And so we are super intentional to try and make sure that we have a place for everybody to be able to get into one of these groups. So later in the service, I'm going to walk you through how to fill out that card, and I'm going to encourage you to get into one of these 6-week groups. And that initiates a massive process on the back end where we start putting all of these groups together. And you might find it interesting to know, because we do this every year, that we track the numbers, and 80% of groups that we put together continue to meet. They have such a connection that they don't want to lose that. But maybe you have tried one of these before and the group didn't continue. Maybe even it happened more than once. I just want to encourage you that to keep trying, because when it clicks, it is really, really special. And I would love for you to experience that. Okay, so as we're looking at kind of the big picture around groups and how when we understand the backstory that we get the beauty, I want you to take out your notes if you haven't done so yet. And I want to share with you 4 principles that can help us learn to appreciate God's art. Remember, groups are like art appreciation. But we can all at times miss the value of art. Some of the most famous pieces of work of art today that would sell for tens of millions of dollars were created by artists who lived in obscurity and poverty because the people in their day and time did not see the value in it. And likewise, we can do the same thing with God's art. For example, when we make snap judgments about people, we miss the true value of those people in our lives. It reminds me of when my oldest son was 7 years old. He would color pictures for his mother and I and bring them to us, and we would proudly display them on the refrigerator. Now, after what seemed like an appropriate amount of time to me, I would, let's just say, declutter the refrigerator. Now, this probably would have gone unnoticed if it wasn't for one thing. You see, one of my son's chores was to collect the garbage each week. Oh boy. Yeah, so he would go and collect the garbage, and he would come across his discarded art, and he would bring it into us, holding up his crumpled up art with a look that could only say, "How could this have happened?" Now, as a parent, oh my goodness, I feel horrible in that moment. So I do the only thing I can think to do, which is to match his look of shock and disgust and say, "How could this have happened? We've got to get this back on the refrigerator where it belongs." Clearly, I was not seeing the value in his art that he was. So regardless of our level of sophistication when it comes to art, we can all use a little help at times, especially as it relates to God's art. And so the first way that we can learn to appreciate God's art is to be in relationship. Now, being in relationship is great when everyone gets along. But in the real world, it's not always as easy, because in the real world, sometimes relationships can get messy and we can hurt each other. And this reality has soured some people's attitude towards the church. I'll talk with some people that will say, I'm good with God, but I am done with the church. And look, I get it, especially when you've been hurt. But here's the thing, and I really want us to get this. God cannot grow us vertically in our relationship with Him if we are unwilling to grow horizontally in our relationship with one another. The Apostle John puts it this way. He says, "Dear friends, let us continue to love one another." That is the horizontal relationship, for love comes from God. Anyone who loves, that is, anyone who loves one another, is a child of God and knows God. But anyone who does not love one another does not know God, for God is love. The reality is we need each other because God designed it this way. And when your world is falling apart, when you lose a loved one, you lose your job, you find yourself sick or in the hospital, well, compassion often comes from people with whom you are in relationship. And when people in your community are suffering similar fates, you have the opportunity to serve them when you are in relationship. And so it is in relationship that we experience both sides of compassion. And it can be the very thing that helps us to stand up under life's unexpected. Okay, the second way that we can learn to appreciate God's art is to be real. We're all tempted at times to pretend. We're tempted to show people what we think they want to see, rather than to simply be authentic. There was a graduate level professor that would give his art appreciation students a test each year, and he would show them this image, and he would say, I want you to analyze this Jackson Pollock painting and describe why it is good. Now, it was only after they had given very eloquent answers using very big words that he would show them that this image was actually a close-up of his studio apron. Now, before we're too hard on the grad students, we have to acknowledge that we have the same tendency to pretend. You know, I'll tell you one area we do it all the time is social media. You know, we know that it's silly to compare. We know that people only post the good stuff on social media. They'll post the cute little baby bump, not the costly fertility treatments. They'll post the new engagement, not the devastating breakup. Or the newly remodeled home. Nobody posts the late fees and collection notices. One person put it this way. He said, we have got to stop comparing our behind-the-scenes struggles with everyone else's highlight reels. But you know, the problem is, there are so few places in this world where it's safe to share our behind-the-scenes struggles. And this is why groups are so important. It is one of the few places that we don't have to hide and we don't have to pretend. It oftentimes surprises people how quickly their group will connect and bond with one another. It oftentimes just takes one person to be real and it can change the whole group dynamic. Okay, so as we've looked at this concept of being real, we've talked about one misstep that people make, and that is when we fake it or we pretend, we miss the point. But there's a second misstep that also misses the point. And with this one, what happens is people, they swing the pendulum all the way to the other side, and they start to use the idea of being real and authentic as an excuse for bad behavior. I call it being a that's just how I am Christian. And so if you have a temper and you blast somebody in your anger, and rather than apologizing and repairing the relationship, you say, well, I'm just the kind of person who tells it like it is. That's just who I am. When we find those words coming out of our mouth, that's just who I am, we have to be really, really careful, because it is an indicator that Satan is crouching at the door, ready to pounce. You see, Satan wants to convince us that our sin is our identity. Satan wants to convince us that our past is our identity, that our temptation and our struggle is our identity. And so if you have a felony, he wants you to believe that you're gonna be nothing more than a felon. And since that's all I'm ever gonna be, well, then I might as well embrace it. Or if you're filled with resentment and bitterness, he wants you to tell yourself, well, I'm just the kind of person who doesn't let things go easily. That's just who I am. Satan wants us to anchor our identity to what we have done rather than to whom Christ has made us to become. I'd like for you to jot that down at the bottom of your notes. Satan wants us to anchor our identity to what we have done rather than to whom Christ has made us to become. In describing this same principle, one author describes the Christian journey this way. He says, come as you are, but don't stay as you are. You see, come as you are means when we come to Jesus, we don't have to clean ourselves up and make ourselves presentable. Rather, we just have to be authentic and real enough to acknowledge that we can't do this on our own, and we certainly can't save ourselves. And then once we make a decision to follow Jesus, something inside of us fundamentally changes. Our identity changes. Jesus described this phenomenon using the word picture of being born again. It's a picture of new life. Similarly, the Apostle Paul used the phrase to describe this as new creation. Here's what he says. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old is gone. The new is here. When we become a Christian, who we are fundamentally changes. And so, yes, we come as we are, but we don't stay as we are. We don't anchor our identity to sin or our past temptations or struggles. Rather, we anchor our identity to the reality of whom Christ has made us to become. Does it mean we don't struggle? Well, of course not. But what it does mean is that we don't anchor the struggle to who we are. Rather, we adjust what we do to be consistent with whom Christ has made us to become. So the third way that we can learn to appreciate God's art is to be an encourager. You know, I can slip into being the critic rather than the encourager as easily as anybody else. The problem is that people are starving for words of affirmation and encouragement. Maybe you heard the story about the man who walks into a diner and he asks the waitress behind the counter if he can use the payphone. So these are the days before cell phones. And the waitress points him to the payphone, he puts a quarter in, he dials the number, and he says, "Hello, Mr. Jones, this is Bob Smith. I was wondering if you have a place in your organization for a smart, hardworking sales manager to manage your sales team." And with the waitress still within earshot, he continues, "Yes, okay, I see. So you're saying you already have a smart, hardworking sales manager and you're very pleased with him. Okay, well, thank you for your time, sir. Have a good day." As he hangs up the phone, he gets a big smile on his face. And as he walks to the door, he starts to whistle. Now, this is really perplexing to the waitress. And so with a touch of attitude, she says, "What are you so happy about? You just got rejected." He turns to her and he says, "Actually, I didn't. You see, I am that smart, hardworking sales manager who works for that company. I just wanted to make sure that my boss, Mr. Jones, thought so too." You see, he just needed to hear it. And likewise, we do not outgrow our need for affirmation and encouragement. In the New Testament, we meet somebody who embodied this principle. His name was Barnabas. His given name was Joseph, but he was given the nickname Barnabas, which means son of encouragement. Now think about this for a moment. When you are hanging out with the disciples and they give you a nickname like the son of encouragement, you are the real deal. And so there's some things that we can learn about encouragement by looking at his life. So the first thing that we see in Barnabas' life is that he was generous. You see, the early church in Jerusalem was growing rapidly, and a need for material help became apparent. Well, Barnabas sees the need, and he decides to do something about it. Here's what the text says. Barnabas sold a field he owned, and he brought the money to put at the apostles' feet. And so we see in this something that is true of both encouraging people and is true of generous people. They are both really good at focusing on the needs of others rather than on their own needs. And they are oftentimes very good at seeing in us what we do not yet see in ourselves. And these moments happen beautifully in group life. I remember I was in a life group where somebody shared that they had initiated a spiritual conversation with somebody at work. This was a huge growth step for this person. And before I could even say anything, somebody else in the group said, "Wow, you have grown so much. 6 months ago, there's no way you would have engaged in a conversation like that." These are sacred moments in group life. And the reason is this: it is really hard to see spiritual growth in the mirror. Oftentimes, we only see it when somebody else points it out in us. When somebody else sees that potential and what could be, it's very powerful. And this is another thing that Barnabas did. He was really good at seeing what could be rather than what had been. And he did this specifically in the life of the Apostle Paul. You might remember that prior to Paul's conversion and seeing Jesus on the road to Damascus, that he was a persecutor of the Christians. But after his conversion, everything changed for Paul. God even changed his name from Saul to Paul. But even though he had changed, his past reputation still preceded him. And so here's what the text says. It says, back in Jerusalem, he, that's Saul, tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him. They didn't trust him one bit. But then Barnabas, the encourager, took him under his wing. He introduced him to the apostles and stood up for him, told them how Saul had seen and spoken to the master on the Damascus road, and how in Damascus itself he had laid his life on the line with his bold preaching in Jesus' name. After that, he was accepted as one of them, going in and out of Jerusalem with no questions asked, uninhibited as he preached in the master's name. I love how it says that Barnabas took Paul under his wing. He vouches for somebody that nobody else trusts, and the result is fruitful ministry. And he does something similar in the life of his cousin, John Mark. A little bit of the backstory on this one is Paul and Barnabas become good friends, and they decide to go on a missionary journey together. And so Barnabas brings along his cousin, John Mark, but partway through this mission trip, John Mark abruptly leaves, and this really frustrates Paul. And so when it comes time to go on a second missionary journey, a sharp disagreement breaks out between Paul and Barnabas, because Paul's like, I am not bringing that guy along again after what he did last time. But Barnabas wants to give him another chance. And as a result of that disagreement, they part ways, and Barnabas ends up going on his own mission trip and bringing along John Mark. Again, we see in Barnabas's life, he's standing up for, vouching for people that others don't trust. And later in Paul's life, we see the fruit of Barnabas having taken John Mark under his wing. Late in his life, as Paul sat in a Roman prison, here is what he wrote to Timothy. He said, get John Mark and bring him with you, because he is helpful to me in my ministry. These two men that Barnabas encouraged, supported, stood up for, and vouched for went on to write nearly half of the New Testament. Paul wrote 14 letters to churches that are recorded in our New Testament, and his cousin John Mark went on to write the Gospel of Mark. You see, Barnabas believed in second chances. And one of the things I love about my church is at Northview, so do we. It's one of the reasons why I love our life recovery groups, especially our groups around sexual integrity and addiction. You see, for far too long, the church has had a history of shooting their wounded rather than helping them and restoring them. The truth is, you are more than the sum total of your greatest regret. And like Barnabas, our life recovery groups say we are not going to leave you behind, because the mission of God needs you. So the fourth principle when it comes to appreciating God's art is to take a risk. Barnabas took a risk. He was generous when he didn't know if he would have enough. He stood up for people. He vouched for people that could have embarrassed him and let him down. But I'll tell you what, we also have to take a risk if we are going to enter into being in relationship, if we're going to encourage one another, and especially if we're going to be real, if we're going to take our wall down and just be our authentic selves. And so in just a moment, I'm going to invite you to take a very tangible risk to sign up to get into one of these 6-week life groups for this series coming up. And I want to acknowledge for some of you, that is a risk. It feels scary. You don't know if you're ready. I just want to ask you to take a risk and accept that the reward in this is so worth the risk. Because I'll tell you what, all of the good stuff in life happens when we take a risk. And so this 6-week series that we're going to be doing, it's a series that actually is kind of about taking a risk. The name of it is GoPro. And we are going to be exploring for 6 weeks this principle, that we will never be more alive than when we are living God's adventure for our life. And so I would love to show you just a short preview of this. So let me share this with you.
My name is Kim. I'm not what you would call adventurous, but during this series, GoPro, we want to get you thinking about living a life on God's adventure. So I'm going to try some new things, and we are going to hear from some people who are living an adventurous life for God.
I've never had a thing where I feel like I would give my lifetime to this. And that's how I feel now.
That way it's not Sunday, church is over awesome, and it wears off on Saturday. It's I'm a part of something now.
But ultimately, our life is about bringing glory to God. It's about building a relationship with Him, and it's about pointing towards Him and worshiping Him. And when that happens, that's when things in life start to come together.
I feel as if I'm having church and experiencing church when I am right there on the sidewalk with my friends.
I contend that you're not going to grow in your faith if you're not serving God.
When the church takes its stand in this world, the people will come. And they're not coming because we're that good. They're coming because God is that good.
Yeah, this is going to be, I think, one of the best spiritual growth campaigns that we've ever done. And so I want to get as many of you, all of you, involved in one of these groups. The first thing I want to do, though, is if you have a student that is 7th to 12th grade, I would like for you to text the word student to 85379. And that will send a link so that they can get into a life group. And they will be doing the same GoPro series that we are doing in their life group. And then if you would take out the card that you've started to fill out, and you'll notice in the upper left-hand corner, if you're already in a group, all you need to do is put the name of the leader, and you're done with that part of that's all you need to do, because you'll be doing GoPro as well as all of our groups are. Now, if you're not in a group, here's where I want to ask you to take a risk. I'm going to ask you to fill out the rest of this card, and in just a moment, we're going to pass them down the aisles. We're going to collect them. And just a few things to draw your attention to. There's some questions about demographic and type of group and any child care needs. I want to draw your attention to the days of the week. As many days as you can give us as options helps us tremendously in getting a good group for you. So if you look at the days of the week and you're like, I know we couldn't do Monday or Tuesday, then just put an X through Monday, an X through Tuesday, leave the rest of them unmarked, and we'll know that that means you're available any of the rest of those days. And then just one other thing I want to draw your attention to is that there's a box that says, I would be willing to host if needed. And I'll tell you what, I would love it if you would check that box, because I want to make sure we have a place for everybody. Now, maybe you're saying, man, I was thinking that we wouldn't host a group this time, but I would rather host a group than run the risk of having people not have a place. Well, you checking that box gives us that option to be able to check in with you if we get into a bind. Okay, so I'm going to have you pass those cards to the left, and you just pass those down the end of the aisle, and our ushers can come forward, and they're going to take those stacks. Just a few things that I want to put on your radar. We're going to send out an email this week just verifying what you wrote on the card. So please look for that and just make sure that what you intended to tell us, we actually received, because that's how we're going to put those groups together. And then the other thing is on August 29th, that's D-Day, we will let you know your group assignment on that day. So be looking for that. If you're still working on your card, that's okay. You can just drop it off to the ushers on the way out. Let me go ahead and close this in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you, Lord, that you are actively at work in our lives, that you care for us and you are writing our stories. And so, Lord, I pray as we take a risk that everybody in this auditorium would take that risk to get into a group for this series, that you would use it to grow us spiritually and connect us relationally. And we ask these things in Jesus' name, amen.